welcome to Leaders of Tomorrow, India's only daily television platform for small businesses. Tonight, a very special bulletin, Decoding the Impact of Budget 2020. For you, the MSME, SME and startup entrepreneur. I'm being joined by two guests live in exclusive, both of whom need no introduction. Montek Singh Ahluwalia joining us live from Delhi. Kiran Mazumdar Shaw joining us live from Bengaluru. I want to start by talking about sentiment and whether this budget, to the two of you, this question is open, was a balanced budget or the booster shot that the economy was looking for. Maybe I can come to you first, Mr. Ahluwalia. What's your take?
Well, you know, it's very difficult to calibrate a budget to respond to sentiment. I mean, the fact is that budgets always talk about everything, and that's what happened this time also. I mean, the finance minister addressed every constituency that you can think of. But you know, the central point at the moment in the economy is there's a lack of demand. And frankly, this is primarily a collapse on the investment side, particularly private investment. Now, you know, when there's a lack of demand, people think immediately that it's consumption demand that should be stoked up. But the truth is, if investment were picked up, then income would go up and consumption would rise automatically. So to my mind, at the present moment, two things need to be done to stimulate demand. You do need to stimulate demand because capacity utilization across the board is very low. I think the best way of stimulating demand would be to get investment back into the system. And that, I think, addresses the question of investor sentiment. Why is it low? What is it that we can do to help it? On the consumption side, if you're going to stimulate consumption, it ought to be the consumption in rural areas and the lower income category. So that's why I feel that, you know, tax incentives, which actually only affect the upper income groups, are not really going to do very much to stimulate demand. You want to stimulate demand, you need to put in more money into the kind of programs that would increase construction activity in rural areas, create productive assets in rural areas, generally expand infrastructure in the economy, and address the loss of sentiment, the loss of confidence, loss of animal spirits, if you like, in the private sector.
Okay.
Now, I'm sure the government wants to do that, but we need to zero in on what are the things that are most likely to achieve that. And I don't think fiddling with tax rates is the critical thing there. There are other problems that we have to address.
Okay, I'll come to you to ask you what do you think are the other issues that need to be addressed. But Ms. Shaw, we had spoken to you before the budget in an exclusive interview to ask you what you think really needs to be done. One of the things you had mentioned, of course, was sentiment. I'll come back to that. But to kick off tonight's panel, do you think it was balanced? Do you think it was a much needed booster that was really needed as far as the economy is concerned?
Well, I think from a sentiment point of view, it has been very positive for India Inc. because I think it had started with the reduction of corporate tax a few months ago. And now I think they have introduced a large number of measures. In fact, I think what is important for the government to continue to do is to be consistent about their pro-business policies. You know, they started off promising to be pro-business, then they sort of basically went back on that. Now they are back again, supporting India Inc. with a lot of promises. I think this whole messaging and signaling about ending tax terrorism is very welcome. But I think the policy and the messaging must be consistent and predictable. You know, that is what will actually boost investor sentiment. Now, to one of the other aspects is that I certainly believe that the government's plan to invest in infrastructure is extremely important. And as Mr. Ahluwalia said, I think investing in infrastructure is going to be extremely vital to create jobs and investment. And I think that is going to be very important from the government's point of view. I think the government's divestment plans are going to be extremely critical to do this.
Sure.
And I also believe that India Inc. has also started investing given the lower tax rates. But you know, the impact of this investment is going to be gestational. So before you see the impact on job creation and on return on investment, it's going to take a few years more. So right now we do need to focus on consumption, and I believe that you know, the investment of the government in infrastructure is going to be important. I also like some of the measures that they have announced for entrepreneurs and the whole startup ecosystem.
Sure.
Let's hope that also creates some josh.
Absolutely. So there's been a couple of announcements that have come in both for MSMEs as well as startups. But I want to pick up on something that you said, and that was, you know, tax terrorism. Mr. Ahluwalia, you were talking about the fact that, you know, this is not, this is perhaps the best way to, you know, when you're looking at sentiment, but you have to look at much more when it comes to investments. My question is, for India's entrepreneurs, one thing is consumer sentiment, of course, in putting more money into the hands of consumers. But the other thing, and that's something that most entrepreneurs tell us, is to actually get spending going. What's it going to take? Mr. Ahluwalia, you were saying there are a couple of things that need to be fixed and fixed perhaps quickly. What's that going to take?
I don't think there's anything much that you can do, frankly, on the tax front
Sure.
to get consumers to spend. I mean, you know, there's no constraint on consumers. I mean, they will be looking at their own economic prospects. Now, a couple of problems.
Sure.
I mean, if, for example, property values have fallen, then there's a sort of a wealth effect. They feel poorer than they used to. If jobs are not coming around, there's uncertainty on the economic front, and people will not spend. So it's not easy to accept a stagnant or a very low growth situation and then jack up consumption. I think you need to address some of the reasons why not just consumption but investment has gone down. You mentioned tax terrorism. I mean, this is not a new problem. This has existed, this complaint has been there often. You know, the root cause of it, I think, is that our tax laws are actually quite vague, and they can be interpreted any which way. Taxmen are under a lot of pressure to generate more revenue. So from their point of view, interpreting the tax laws in a way that generates the maximum revenue is kind of a natural thing to do. If you want to address that, it's not enough to say we don't approve of tax terrorism. No government approves of tax terrorism. Actually, you need a root and branch review of the tax code and the tax laws to make it clear that these are not situations where tax liability should be brought in. And that's a lot of hard work. It's not enough to say tax terrorism will not be tolerated. So I think the question is, are we going into that? Are we doing enough of that, taking care of the fine print? And that's critical. It's also I think there's the case, you know, where the government keeps appealing tax issues even when it loses at lower levels. That does not create the kind of environment that people think is conducive to building trust between the taxpayer and the government. So lots of things have to be done to fix that.
Okay. Mr. Ahluwalia is talking about the fine print. Ms. Shaw, the headlines at least definitely looking good. As far as small businesses are concerned, my question to you is, yes, tax terrorism is not something new, but at least there have been a few announcements at this point, given all the sentiment that we're seeing, given, you know, everything that we've seen in the news of late. Corporate tax rates now in India at one of the lowest anywhere in the world. So at least looking at the headlines, if not the fine print, would you say you're happy in terms of what has been announced for entrepreneurs?
Well, as I said, you know, I think it's very good for business. I think this is the first, you know, budget from this government which has been very pro-business.
Sure. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yeah, so I think, you know, this has been a very pro-business budget. And I think that what needs to be done is to make sure that all the other plans that the government has in terms of divestment, in terms of investment in infrastructure, in transportation, and all the other schemes that they've talked about must be implemented with a sense of urgency, and that's where we always have a problem in this country. So I think given the fact that we have a pretty challenging economic situation, and as Mr. Ahluwalia rightly said, to try and kickstart anything when we are in this kind of a sentiment is very difficult. So I think you do need to basically revive sentiments, boost sentiments, give the confidence back to people and business, and then you'll probably start seeing some investment and demand kicking in. And one of the areas that I think that the government did not address is the real estate sector. So while affordable housing got some benefit, as Mr. Ahluwalia said, today the biggest concern is that there's a huge inventory of unsold assets in the real estate sector, and that is causing a huge stress for this sector, and it's also causing a sense of devalued apprehension in the minds of the consumer. So I think you've got to fix some of those apprehensions.
Absolutely, and we here at ET Now have been looking at what's it going to take to move to the $5 trillion economy and beyond. And as you were speaking, Ms. Shaw, we just had on our screen graphics of an interview we did previously with Niranjan Hiranandani pre-budget, where he's speaking specifically about what was needed for the real estate space. Unfortunately, not too much commentary coming in there, and those comments are back on your screen. I just want to come back and talk some specific announcements that we've seen for the startup space. Very quickly, I want to read them out for our viewers. Corporate tax rates, along with being the lowest anywhere in the world, startups with a turnover of 100 crores are now going to enjoy a 100% deduction for 3 of the 10 years that they've been operational. Tax payment on ESOPs being deferred. Good news for startups, good news for those in the digital space. Along with all the announcements that we've seen today, this is open to both of my guests. Are you happy given that, an equal emphasis perhaps being laid on manufacturing as well as for those in the new economy?
Who is this question for?
Go ahead, Ms. Shaw.
No, so I just think, these are good measures. I think startups need, a good support system, and especially as they are sort of scaling up. I also believe that instead of giving them a sort of a 3 out of 10 year kind of, a tax option, I think they should have just given them a straight 5-year tax holiday after the date of operation, and that would have made it simpler, or even a 10-year tax holiday to make it even sweeter. So I think these are all notional tax realizations which I think the government must be bolder about, giving the benefit to the startup entrepreneur.
Sure. Mr. Ahluwalia, if I can come to you and talk about whether you think equal emphasis in this budget, or at least an attempt has been made as far as the new economy versus manufacturing, the manufacturing sector is concerned.
Well, I think I certainly support the idea that we need to do a lot more for startups. Underneath all this for startups is also the quality of the financial support that the system can give them. That's true not only for startups, but for small and medium industry. And I think there we really have a problem. And part of the problem, quite frankly, is that the government has been disguising its fiscal deficit by not giving refunds, by not making payments, and so on. Now, when the government gets put in a position where it wants to show a smaller deficit and simply delays payments, that really creates a tremendous credit squeeze down the system, because contractors who have to be paid don't get paid, so they don't pay the people who are supplying them. And as you go down the chain, it hurts people who are quite vulnerable. So, both the fact that the banks are in trouble, we haven't done as much as we should have to bring about banking sector reform. I mean, we've talked about it for the last 3 or 4 years. But by now, I think we should have done much more to bring in the reforms needed in banking, to restore the sense of confidence on the part of bankers that they will not be held unreasonably responsible if a loan goes bad because the economic situation has worsened. I think we should have done more. Now, if you ask the question, what is happening on banking reform? I mean, the only answer that you get is that, 10 public sector banks are being merged to form 4 public sector banks. That's not reform. I mean, taking 10 unreformed banks and converting them into 4 unreformed banks is not reform. So to my mind, we should have done much more in the banking sector to free it up and give it flexibility and to give bank managers the confidence that they can go ahead and make commercial decisions. And this would actually help small and medium enterprises. Because remember, the bigger enterprises can get liquidity anyway. I mean, they borrow abroad. So when the banks get squeezed, the impact is really felt on the small and medium. And the squeeze is very large because the fiscal deficit is much more than what is being said. I mean, we heard the finance say that the fiscal deficit has expanded from 3.3% to 3.8%, and in the coming year it should have been 3 and it'll go to 3.5. But knowledgeable people, and there are many who are commenting, that the real fiscal deficit of the center is more than 5%. And if you add to that the fiscal deficit of the states, then quite frankly, the general government, that means the central government and the state government, are together absorbing virtually all the savings being mediated through the financial system. I mean, the household sector is what does the net saving. And that comes to about 10 or maybe 11% of GDP. Now, if 9% of that is picked up by the central and the state governments taken together, there's not very much left for the private sector.
All right.
And that's really where the fiscal imbalance is creating a problem. And
sure.
We need it. I think we need to create a credible program which will persuade people that we are going to bring this fiscal deficit down. And that's going to require more tax revenue and less expenditure of certain kinds, the unproductive kinds. I don't see enough thinking in that area.
Okay, we're going to slip into a short break on that note.
The GST, for example,
sure.
I mean, everybody agrees.
Mr. Ahluwalia, we'll take a quick break. I'm going to come back and talk about GST. I do want to talk about some of the specific sectors, particularly traditional industries like, footwear, etc. That seems some announcement beneficial largely to small businesses. Let's slip into a short break, but we will come back in just a moment. Just stay tuned. Welcome back with us here on Leaders of Tomorrow, decoding the impact of Budget 2020 for entrepreneurs with 2 guests who need no introduction. Kiran Mazumdar Shaw joining us live from Bengaluru, Montek Singh Ahluwalia joining us live from New Delhi. Just before we slipped into the break, Mr. Ahluwalia, you were talking about, GST. There's definitely been a big push, particularly where small businesses are concerned. I do want to let you finish your point that you were making before we slipped into the break, and also talk about the fact that some specific sectors which will have an impact as far as small businesses are concerned, whether it's the customs duty hike that we're talking about in industries like footwear, traditional industries, etc., which typically see small businesses playing there. Do you think that is going to have an impact along with all of the other announcements that we're seeing?
Well, on GST, I was just going to say that
sure.
I wish the finance minister had made it clear that in her view, we need to make some major changes in the GST.
Sure.
I think there's general agreement that this is a major reform. It has not delivered as it was expected. And the principal reason for that is that it's been poorly implemented, it's badly designed, far too many tax rates, too many exclusions, and too many changes in rate in sequential meetings of the GST Council. Now, it would have been a good idea if we could have heard that, the central government is going to go to the GST Council and make certain proposals. We haven't got a clear roadmap there, so I don't know exactly what they plan to do. But in my view, that's very critical. On the customs duties, I'm not in favor of this relapse into protectionism, where a very large number of products, we've raised the customs duties by 10 and 20%. I think we have to ask ourselves that, if we're trying to be competitive in these areas, responding by raising customs duties is the worst way of becoming competitive, because you're simply opening the door to similar demands later on. I think, in my view, if we feel that there was less competition, less competitive ability, we should have allowed the exchange rate to depreciate a little rather than slap on customs duties. As a matter of fact, one of the major thrusts of the reforms of 1991 was to get away from the bad old days when we had very high rates of customs duty. And that was continued by not only the Congress government then, but the United Front and the Vajpayee government that followed. So for several governments, we had a clear thrust of reducing customs duties. And I think it was the Vajpayee government that actually said that we were going to bring duties down to the levels prevalent in Southeast Asian countries. We've reversed that. We've been raising duties in the last 2 or 3 years. So the proposition that this is good for Indian business, in my view, is a bit short-sighted. I think we should have looked at other things that we could have done to help Indian business, not relapse into raising customs duties. It is this kind of thing that makes Indian business unwilling to join things like the regional cooperation agreement with ASEAN, because we're not pushing them into an environment where they feel they have to compete. And if we do that, we will basically isolate ourselves with very damaging effects on growth.
Sure.
So this rise in customs duties, in my view, is a wrong thing to do.
Sure. Ms. Shaw, one of the things that you had spoken to us about when we spoke to you pre-budget was the power of the export markets when it comes to small businesses. Speaking to ET Now earlier this morning, Amitabh Kant has put the focus back on PPPs as far as this budget is concerned, and saying, sentiment and confidence really being brought back as far as the private sector is concerned. I want you to comment on that. I also saw you nodding when Mr. Ahluwalia was talking about protectionist measures as far as, announcements on custom duty hike is concerned.
Yeah. So let me start with the customs duty hike. I completely agree with Mr. Ahluwalia that, we have to make India Inc. competitive. And I personally believe, just like Mr. Ahluwalia mentioned, that it is, the rupee should be allowed to devalue, and I think that will make us more competitive. But apart from that, I think India Inc. must compete on terms that other countries compete. And so I think raising customs duty as a kind of protectionist measure is absolutely not going to be good for the country. As far as the PPP model is concerned, I think it's a very welcome model, but I think the biggest challenge the private sector is again going to have is access to capital. Because when you get into PPP models, the return on investment of these PPP models is not exactly lucrative in many cases. So I think I worry about the access to capital and how private sector is going to basically be able to deliver on these PPP opportunities.
Sure. One very quick last word from the two of you as we're ending tonight's show. And Maybe I could come to you first, Mr. Ahluwalia. In one sentence, if you had anything further that you wish the Finance Minister would perhaps do over the course of the year. We are, of course, at the start of 2020. The budget is just one event. What would you want to say?
Well, in my view, as I said, why one? Let me have three. If in the next 3 months she can give greater clarity on how she intends to push the GST to a logical conclusion, that would be terrific.
Sure.
She has said that she's going to do a kind of a crowdsourcing effort to decide what to do on customs duties. I'd be very happy if she listens to what Kiran Mazumdar Shaw said and clearly told Indian industry that raising customs duties is bad for India. It's actually bad for Make in India and is not good for Make in India. This is controversial, but she would make a major contribution if she did that. And the third thing, quite frankly, is banking. I mean, we have for the last 3 years been waiting to be able to say that this is the reform of the Indian public sector banks, and we haven't got it yet.
Sure.
So if we could do something there, I think it would be terrific.
Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, I'm going to let you have the last word. Given the reality of the situation both here in India as well as what's happening globally, do you think this was the best possible budget that we could have heard from the FM?
Well, I don't think you can call it the best possible budget, but it's a directional budget. I think it's a budget in the right direction, but I think it is all going to depend on how quickly it is implemented, especially on the government expenditure on infrastructure, because that's going to create at least the unskilled jobs, and it will at least benefit some of the infrastructure industry, because that's what can actually start at least creating some jobs and some demand, because cement and steel obviously can benefit from that demand. But something needs to start fast, and that is my concern, that as soon as things start moving, then I think we can have some green shoots really sprouting very rapidly.
Sure. Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, an absolute pleasure having the two of you here tonight on the Leaders of Tomorrow on this special Budget 2020 in decoding its impact. If you have any feedback for us, our contact details coming up on your screens. We are all ears as always. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.